Today is October 3, 2016, and it is the new moon of the 7th month, which is also the memorial of loud blasts, commonly referred to as the Feast of Trumpets. And if anyone here or anyone listening to this later wants to know more about the Feast of Trumpets, the memorial of loud blasts, and so on, I would recommend reading the Silver Trumpet, Volume 1, Number 1. In the main article, it talks about the purpose of the Silver Trumpet, and it's tied to new moons, and the first issue was actually on a Feast of Trumpets or a memorial of loud blasts. But we won't go all into that right now. Before we get into the subject and I explain what it is and everything, we'll ask our Heavenly Family to bless us and guide us. And then, as usual, we have much to cover. So let's pray. Eloheinu, Heavenly Family, Todah Lakal Havabah. Thank you for everything so very much. Thank you for the truth. Please help us to understand it. Help us to grasp the principles of truth and of righteousness. Please, please, Heavenly Family, in this meeting, we want you to be glorified. Please help us to cooperate with you and with the angels in order for the truth to reign and for us to be brought together into unity, just as you prayed. So, Heavenly Family, thank you again, and help me to be able to express the things that you've given for us to look at clearly and concisely and simply. Thank you. We ask these things, B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so it's amazing that we're already at the 7th month again. I guess it's, in a sense, it's not that amazing because obviously time just keeps going on. But there is much, much to do, and this last year has had so much. There's a couple things I'll mention before we get into the particular topic for today. So, as you all know, we haven't had an issue of the Silver Trumpet published for a year. And the reason, well, there's multiple reasons why, but one of the reasons is because the subjects to be covered there are so vast that it will inevitably be a long issue of the Silver Trumpet. It's already very long, and I am certainly not done it yet. So that's one of the reasons. The other reasons are that there's just been so much that we have had to do that I have not had near the time to write as I should have and would like to have. So as the winter months approach here, we will be very busy for a while, and I probably won't have much writing time still for a little while. And then once winter comes, I will most likely have a lot more writing time simply because there won't be as much to do outside, and it will be impossible to do as many outside hours as we can do at this time of year. So those are all different factors. The issue of the Silver Trumpet, well, basically all of Volume 2 will end up being one issue. So that will cover all of the studies from a year ago today. That's the Memorial of Loud Blasts of 2015 up until today, not including today's study. And not every single study will be gone through in that one issue. There's going to be 3 main studies. The other studies that we have or that we have had will be referenced but not explained. People will have to wait for those particular studies to be put in a written form in a format other than the Silver Trumpet. And other than that, they will be in an audio form available for people hopefully sometime soon, but that's not to be expected for several months still. We did get to publish an excerpt from the yet unpublished Silver Trumpet, and that is a change in the priesthood, a change in the law. That's kind of an excerpt from the first part of the first article, but the first article goes far beyond that into matters of ritual purity. If you guys have, if anyone here was not on the study last year, they have actually just been put on YouTube, and they were posted on the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook page. So you can go and listen to them. I will say, though, that in its written form, the subject of ritual purity is brought out a lot more clearly in those studies. There are several things that are laid out in those studies that definitely help to explain it, but I think it's just more clearly expressed in the written form, which, again, isn't available yet. But those studies are there if anyone wants to listen to them, and we will be posting the other studies that we had from that point on soon on YouTube and on Facebook. So for this, we're already getting into what will be Volume 3 of the Silver Trumpet as far as our time zone. So we actually may publish certain issues of Volume 3 before Volume 2 is published. Like today's study, I may quickly put it together in a little Silver Trumpet issue without going through a full explanation of the passage which we will be considering, but posting the passage, giving people a little update on what's happening, maybe a question and answer and so on, just to keep updates. And then we may have that sort of thing for the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles. Also, I just wanted to mention for the Day of Atonement and Feast of Tabernacles, we will see where our Heavenly Family guides with all of this. But one of the things which we really, really do need to study, and that requires a lot of focus, so it's perfect for a feast, is the community rule. Obviously, we have had many studies on it, but we've only gotten to a certain point in it so far, and there's so much more to study, and if it is a product of inspiration, we really do need to know it and implement its teachings. So we may end up studying that during the Feast of Tabernacles and perhaps even discussing it on the Day of Atonement. I know that this whole issue of the virgin birth has kind of taken over our studies for a while, which is good because it's so full of principle. But I know that this subject of the community rule cannot be left for too long. It's something that we really do need to come back to, and there are many things in the community rule which we have not even touched on yet. So, all that said, we'll see where our Heavenly Family leads. The subject for today is another text found in the Dead Sea Scrolls known as Barki Nafshi. And does anyone here know what Barki Nafshi means?
Isn't that a word we went over not too long ago, bless my soul or something like that?
Yep, that's it. Bless my soul. So Barki Nafshi, and it is the title of a document in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or I'll say a text in the Dead Sea Scrolls. When we talk about a particular text, we're talking about a recognizable composition. So you would say Isaiah is a text, or Paul's letter to the Romans is a text. And then there are many different scrolls and fragments of those texts. But this is a text, Barki Nafshi. It's a certain composition, a certain written work, for which there are 5 copies that were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And those copies are all fragmentary. There's not a complete scroll among them, but there are several large sections which are very well preserved. And these 5 documents or 5 copies of Barki Nafshi are known as 4Q 434, 4Q 435, 4Q 436, 437, and 438. So those are the copies. And there is, of course, a translation of some of those fragments in Giza Vermez's translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, though not all of the fragments are translated. And even in what we're going to go through today, we are not going to go through all of the fragments because some of them are just small and there's just a few letters or a couple words. Some of them don't even have any letters on them, some of the fragments. And so obviously we won't go through everything because there's not any content that is full enough to have much meaning in its present form. But there is a lot to this particular text. So if any of you guys want to follow along, it's called Barki Nafshi, B-A-R-K-I is the first word. Nafshi is N-A-F-S-H-I. That's found in Giza Vermez's translation. If you go to the index at the back and look up 4Q 434 in whatever translation you have, you should be able to easily locate this text. So if anyone wants to follow along, I'll give you a moment to do that. And while you guys are looking it up, I'll mention a few other things about Barki Nafshi before really getting into reading it. So again, Heavenly Family, please help me to express these things clearly. Toda, Achoti. Okay, so I'm going to just mention a few things, and we won't go through and read all of the evidence for it yet, because we are going to read it as we go through this text. So just for sake of time, I'll mention them, and then we will take note of certain things as we read, rather than reading it ahead of time and then going back and reading all those passages again in order to understand their meaning. So this text goes back to a period which must precede the time of Herod, and it goes back at least to the Hasmonean period. The Hasmoneans are the Maccabees, so it goes back at least that far, so somewhere in perhaps the early 2nd century BCE, which is actually the time of the teacher of righteousness and the founding of the community known as the Sons of Light, later known as the Essenes. So this document goes back to about that time. We know that it doesn't go back way, way earlier because it makes statements that build upon and refer to late, quote-unquote, biblical documents. So books like Zechariah, that's early Second Temple period writings that this refers back to. And so this must come after that time. So this can't be like an ancient writing of David or something like that. This comes after the time of Isaiah and Jeremiah and the Psalms and so on, because it references a number of things found within those writings. Also, it can be known that this text belongs to the unique writings of the Qumran community, because it shares in their unique terminology. More than that, it's very likely that this text was written by the teacher of righteousness. We've seen in previous studies that the thanksgiving hymns were written by the teacher of righteousness. The teacher of righteousness, again, was the founder of the Qumran community, and he was viewed by them clearly as a prophetic teacher or a prophet, a messenger of God, a steward of the mysteries of God is another way that one could put it. But he was a very important leader. He was what we might call an apostle, because he wasn't just a prophet who had a very short period of a mission, but he was called to be the leader of a movement and to bear a message for most likely an extended period of time. So some of the ways that we can know that Barki Nafshi was most likely written by the teacher of righteousness are the following. First, there is an extensive amount of shared vocabulary between Barki Nafshi and Hodayot. The Hodayot are the Thanksgiving hymns. So, again, the Damascus document talks about the teacher of righteousness and how he came and showed us the way of God's heart. And then the Thanksgiving hymns have repeated the master, the instructor, speaking in first person and saying how he has shown the way of God's heart and all of these different things. And in the Thanksgiving hymns, he explains the way of God's heart and the various things that are said in texts like the Damascus document and in the Habakkuk Pesher, which is a commentary on the book of Habakkuk. It also speaks of the teacher of righteousness. So the things that are said concerning the teacher of righteousness in documents such as those match very well the sorts of things that one finds in the Thanksgiving hymns and other documents, including Barki Nafshi. In the Thanksgiving hymns, for instance, the writer self-identifies as being a leader, as being the one who brings people into the community, as being the one through whom the Holy Spirit reveals the mysteries of God. That's the way that it's put in the Thanksgiving hymns. Now, you find similar vocabulary or the vocabulary that is found in those Thanksgiving hymns that is unique to them. And when I say unique to them, I mean unique to them and the other writings which most likely go back to the teacher of righteousness. That set of vocabulary is also found in Barki Nafshi. Not just the vocabulary, but the images and the themes, the topics, the ideas. The same theology is expressed, the same belief system, the same message is conveyed, of course, in the broad sense. Every message has a broad sense of the message. If you talk about the branch message, that's very, very broad. And it's the same message no matter which study you listen to. But there are so many various different messages within the overall message, different studies, different topics, and so on. So Barki Nafshi, while it is covering different ground, it has the same basic message as found in the Thanksgiving hymns, the community rule, and like documents. And then perhaps the strongest evidence for Barki Nafshi being composed by the teacher of righteousness is the self-understanding expressed by its author. So self-understanding and expressing that self-understanding using the same vocabulary, same images, same themes. So the self-understanding within Barki Nafshi of its author is that he had been appointed as a messenger and as a revealer of secrets and as one who is fulfilling the roles of ancient significant figures. This is also found in the Thanksgiving hymns. The author of the Thanksgiving hymns and the author of Barki Nafshi, who again we're saying is the same person, viewed himself as fulfilling the words of the Psalms of David, of the prophecies of Isaiah, and of several other prophecies throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. And the way that is the words in the Davidic Psalms which apply to David are taken as applying to the author of these hymns and of these particular poetic writings. So the author of Barki Nafshi takes the words from the Davidic Psalms, which clearly originally applied to David, and then applies them to himself. Likewise, the prophecies of Isaiah, particularly what scholars call Deutero-Isaiah, which starts in Isaiah chapter 40 and onward, those prophecies foretell a figure who will be appointed by God to accomplish a very specific and important work. And that work in Isaiah includes being a revealer of the truth that God has to proclaim, as well as assembling the tribes and being instrumental in the establishment of God's kingdom. Now, Barki Nafshi applies the prophecies of that figure to its author. And there are also some other things which I won't mention yet, but we will get to them, other prophecies that talk about significant figures that are applied to the author here. And with that self-identification, it becomes obvious that whoever wrote Barki Nafshi is claiming inspiration. That becomes quite clear. Likewise, Barki Nafshi is written in a way which shows that its author understood himself to be purified from sin and having the mission to proclaim the way of God's heart and to promote purity. This is all very much so the sorts of things that we find in the Thanksgiving hymns and the community rule and the sectarian literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls in general. Also, as in the Thanksgiving hymns and elsewhere, the Barki Nafshi texts are very apocalyptic, as in they portray a time which is the dawning of a what's the best way to put this? The dawning of the restoration of all things. It places itself at a time that is what we would refer to as the last days, the end of time as we know it. And this becomes quite clear as we will go through this, especially when we get to the second fragment, which we will consider. So those are all different factors that will be brought out as we go on, which highlights for us one of the things that we saw in the Thanksgiving hymns. We've studied several Thanksgiving hymns and have found that while they applied in the days of the teacher of righteousness, they also apply today, because that which was only partially fulfilled in the time of the teacher of righteousness is again being fulfilled today. And so long as we are willing to move forward with the divine plan of our heavenly family, it will be brought to its completion. In other words, it will meet its ultimate fulfillment. So in that case, the Thanksgiving hymns and Barki Nafshi and potentially many other texts can and hopefully will meet their final fulfillment here in our day. So we have to keep these things in mind as we look at this. It applied then, but it didn't go through. If this is really a product of inspiration, then its application also applies today. And I think as we go through this, you guys will see how the circumstances described certainly do apply today, and I would say even more fully than they did in the time in which they were written. So hopefully you guys are all there. For those of you who want to follow along in your translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls, hopefully you guys are there. It is 4Q 434, and we will be starting with Fragment 1, Column 1. This is actually the beginning of the text. It's a blessing to have the beginning, because for many Dead Sea Scrolls, the beginning of a document and the end of a document are not preserved. With this one, we actually have the beginning. And it's Barki Nafshi et Adoni. Bless my soul, the Lord, for all his wonders forever. Now, one of the things that I'll mention here, it's not saying bless my soul as in the soul being the object of the blessing. The Lord is the object of the blessing. The soul is to bless. So I think a clearer way to translate this will be, bless my whole being, bless the Lord for all his wonders forever. So it's the author speaking to himself and commanding his whole being to bless the Lord for all his wonders forever. Now, one of the things that we will find as we go through this text is that Barki Nafshi is so largely based off of previously written scriptures. In fact, so much so that it will be impossible for us to really consider all of the various scriptures upon which Barki Nafshi is based. I will mention many scriptures, and we will read less of them. So I think it will be good for you guys, if you would like to study this later, to write down the texts which I will mention. And as I read or mention certain scripture references, I will try to say them slowly enough for you to write down. So the first thing to point out is that this phrase, Barki Nafshi, is not original to this particular writing. We actually have a few occurrences of it within the Psalms in the Scriptures, or I'll say in the Scriptures that we are familiar with. We have it in Psalm 103 and Psalm 104. So I'll read to you guys the verses or the references of these Psalms. Psalm 103, verse 1 and 2, and also verse 22. So that is the first two verses of Psalm 103 and the last verse. Again, that's Psalm 103, verses 1, 2, and 22. And also, there is Psalm 104, verses 1 and 35. Again, that's the first verse and the last verse. And unfortunately, for Barki Nafshi, we do not have the last section of it, so we don't know whether or not it ends with the phrase Barki Nafshi. And the other thing I will point out, we won't go and read all of this right now, but Psalm 103 in particular has some thematic parallels to Barki Nafshi, and also even vocabulary. There's a lot of similarity to the point where it can be known for sure that Barki Nafshi is using Psalm 103 as one of its sources or one of the things upon which it bases itself. And perhaps I will read a little bit of Psalm 103 so you guys can get the flavor, and it will sound familiar as we read Barki Nafshi. So Psalm 103, verse 1 and 2. By David, bless Yahweh, O my soul, and all within me, bless his holy name. Bless Yahweh, O my soul, and do not forget all his benefits. And then verse 22, bless Yahweh, all his works, in all the places of his dominion. Bless Yahweh, O my soul. Okay, so you have this Barki Nafshi thing happening here. And again, the same thing occurs in Psalm 104, verse 1 and 35. Psalm 103 has parallels in that it's, bless the Lord and bless his name. And it has a number of other parallels throughout it. So let's read the first few lines now of Barki Nafshi. This will be lines 1 to 4a. Bless my whole being. Bless the Lord for all his wonders forever. And bless his name, for he has delivered the life of the poor, and the humble he has not despised. And he has not forgotten the distress of the helpless. He has opened his eyes upon the helpless, and has heard the cry of the orphans, stretching out his ear to their cry. In the abundance of his compassion, he has shown favor to the needy. He is opening their eyes to see his ways, and their ears to hear his teaching. So, first of all, it's worth noticing that this is emphasizing the Lord's care for the downtrodden, for the outcasts. It's the same sort of thing that you find in the New Testament in several places where, in Luke 6, verse 20, for instance, we have the phrase, bless the poor. I know in Matthew it's blessed are the poor in spirit, but in Luke it's blessed are the poor. So here, those who are outcast, who are downtrodden, are blessed in Barki Nafshi, and Yahweh remembers them. The Lord has not forgotten them. He is seeking to deliver them. He opens his eyes to them, which means he's paying attention to them and is looking with mercy upon them. That sort of usage of opening the eyes, meaning to look upon someone with mercy, is found in Zechariah 12, verse 4. And many other scriptures, but that's a good reference. Talks about how the Lord, how he has opened his eyes upon Judah. And the idea is that it is in mercy. He's looking upon them with mercy. So in the New Testament, you find the idea of poverty portrayed somewhat positively. Christ tells his followers to sell all that they have, and so on and so forth. So a couple other references to this are Luke 12:33 and Luke 18:22. And it's evident that many of the followers of Christ were actually poor, and we'll read a couple of scriptures that relate to that. James 2:5 says, "Listen, my dear brothers, did not God choose the poor of the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him?" So you see there that James is understanding God to have chosen the poor of the world, and he is making them rich in faith. Likewise, we have 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 to 29. Let's read that. For consider your calling, brothers, that not many were wise according to human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were well born, as in they weren't born of high standing. But the foolish things of the world God chose in order that he might put to shame the wise. And the weak things of the world God chose in order that he might put to shame the strong. And the insignificant of the world and the despised God chose, the things that are not, in order that he might abolish the things that are, so that all flesh may not boast before God. This is the sort of thing that God tends to do, to choose the things that are weak and lowly, humble, and do something absolutely great with them. In fact, David, in 1 Samuel 22, verse 2, is said to have been surrounded by outcasts. It says, every man in distress, and every man who had a creditor, or every man who owed money, and every embittered man gathered to him, and he became their commander. Now there were about 400 men with him. So this little group of people who gathered around David were those who were outcast. And as we will see, Davidic reference is one of the underlying themes within Barki Nafshi. The author understands himself to be fulfilling the role of David in his own day, which, of course, that's in line with the Isaiah prophecies and everything that we've looked at before and that are published in the Silver Trumpet, Volume 1, Numbers 10 and 11, and also Numbers 12 to 14. So here you have, again, it's those who are poor or oppressed are the ones that he is delivering. The Lord has not despised the humble or the lowly, and he has not forgotten the distress of the helpless. It's interesting, there are also a few places within the Qumran writings where the designation of being poor seems to be used for the community. You know, they viewed themselves as somewhat lowly, not necessarily that all of their references portray lowliness, but there are a few places that kind of indicate that lowliness and poorness as a self-designation. And let's see here if I can get one of these references. One moment. Okay. There is a document known as 4Q171, which is a commentary on the Psalms. And it makes a comment on Psalm 37, verse 11, which is a Davidic psalm, which it applies to its own time. And in Psalm 37, verse 11, it says, "And the poor shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant prosperity." Well, in 4Q171, 1 to 2, I think it's probably this is fragment 1 and 2, column 2, lines 8 to 10. I think that's the reference. It says, its interpretation concerns the congregation of the poor, who will endure the time of terror and will be delivered from all the snares of Belial, which seems to be a reference to those who are following the truth. So it's portraying this congregation of the poor as being kind of the right people, or may even be a reference to the Qumran community. So here, these who are poor, these are the ones who have been chosen by God, those who are kind of the outcasts, the downtrodden, the nobodies. He has opened his eyes upon the helpless and has heard the cry of the orphans, stretching out his ear to their cry. Okay, so he not only looks upon them with mercy, but he hears them. Those who are recognizing their lack of parentage, those who are orphans. But of course, he does not leave them as orphans. This also is kind of taken from another psalm, Psalm 34, verse 15. It says this: "The eyes of Yahweh are toward the righteous, and his ears toward their cry for help." So in the days when Barki Nafshi was written, this was being fulfilled through those who were becoming the Qumran community. They were kind of the outcasts. They were the nobodies. They were not of significant lineage or birth or anything like that necessarily. They, were not viewed by the rest of society as being higher up, so to speak. And one of the ways that we know that this was referred to the community is because it's talking about how he's opening their eyes. So this is going on in line 3. "In the abundance of his compassion, he has shown favor to the needy. He is opening their eyes to see his ways and their ears to hear his teaching." Now, prior to this part, most of it has been in what we would probably translate as past tense, and then this is not in past tense. In Hebrew, there is no past, present, and future. The way tenses work, you have perfect and imperfect. It's not dealing with the time reference. It's dealing with the state of the action, whether complete or incomplete. So perfect tense is a completed action, which may have taken place in the past. In fact, probably most of the time it's referring to something that has taken place. But it can also refer to something that will take place, but it is viewed as sure. It's basically completed in that it is definitely going to happen. And then you have imperfect, or the incomplete tense, which is the tense which describes an action that is not complete, which can either be something that has not yet begun and is thus future, or something that has started and is ongoing, which we would translate as present tense. So that's what you have here. He is opening their eyes to see his ways and their ears to hear his teaching. That's an imperfect tense or an incomplete action. And when this was written, that's what was happening. Those who were the outcasts were now having their eyes open to see his ways. His ways, the ways of God, that's something that is used all the time throughout the Qumran writings, or at least the early Qumran writings, such as the Thanksgiving hymns and the community rule. His ways are the ways of truth. We've been going through this, of course, in the community rule. And to hear his teaching. So these poor are not just blessed in that he is going to preserve them and to keep them from being persecuted or anything like that. No, they are blessed because their eyes are being opened to see his ways, and their ears are being opened to hear his teaching. And that's the blessing. So that is what was going on then, and as I'm sure you guys can see, that's what's going on now. None of us are particularly special people in terms of the world's standards. We are all kind of, outcasts, nobodies, the downtrodden, so to speak. Nothing special about us, and in fact, most of us have been cast out by our former communities, and some of us by family, and so on and so forth. So that doubtless was the state of things back then, and it's absolutely the state of things now. Now, the opening of the eyes, this is something that is not having its first reference in Barki Nafshi. It is basing this idea off of the prophecies of Isaiah. Isaiah 35 is one of the chapters, and Isaiah 42 is another. So Isaiah 35, we've gone through this many times since the beginning of this phase of the message, but it talks about a time where there's this great reformation in the wilderness preparatory to going back to the land of our fathers. And I know that many of you are thinking, 9T Reformation, and that's exactly it. Testimonies for the Church, Volume 9, page 126. That's the 9T Reformation. So what does it say here in Isaiah 35? Wilderness and dry land shall be glad. This is starting at verse 1. And a desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly, and it shall rejoice indeed with rejoicing and exulting. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They are the ones who shall see the glory of Yahweh, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make the staggering knees firm. Say to those who are hasty of heart, be strong, you must not fear. Look, your God will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He is the one who will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be opened. Then the lame shall leap like the deer, and the tongue of the dumb shall sing for joy. For waters shall break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert, and the parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. And it goes on and on. We won't read the whole chapter, but I hope that you guys are remembering this. This is highly significant and very important, and it ties together Barki Nafshi with all these various passages that we've been reading since the beginning of this message. So Psalm 68, Isaiah 40, Isaiah 61, Isaiah 42, Isaiah 35. So those are the passages. So another passage which parallels this opening of the eyes in Barki Nafshi is Isaiah 42, verse 7. And for context, I will read from verse 1. Behold, my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my whole being delights. I have put my spirit upon him so that he may establish a just order for the nations. He will not shout, and he will not raise his voice, and he will not cause it to be heard in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dim flax he will not quench, for truly he will establish a just order. He will not be quenched, and he will not be broken, until he has set up a just order in the land. The islands wait for his decree. Thus says the God of the gods, who created the skies and pitched them, who pounded out the earth and her produce, and gave breath to the people upon her, and life to those who walk in her. I, Yahweh, have called you in righteousness. I have grasped you by the hand. I keep you and give you for a covenant of the people, for a light to the nations, to open the eyes of the blind, to bring out from the dungeon those who are bound, and from the prison house those who dwell in darkness. So here we have the commission to this individual, the chosen servant of Deutero-Isaiah, and the task that is given to this individual is the task that is being spoken of in Barki Nafshi. And so we will see more of this as we continue, but this is showing that the time in which Barki Nafshi is fulfilled is the same time that Deutero-Isaiah is fulfilled, and Isaiah 35, and these Davidic Psalms. All of these things tie together. Another thing I'll briefly point out is that there is a parallel between Yahweh opening his eyes upon the helpless and stretching out his ear to their cry, and then he opens their eyes to see his ways and their ears to hear his teaching. It's showing a relationship between the Lord and his people, where he is seeing and hearing them and they are seeing and hearing him. This is something which is a time that is special. It's not like this all the time. It should be like this all the time, but it hasn't been like this all the time. So, for instance, in Deuteronomy 29, verse 4, this is the end of the wilderness wanderings, and what it says, this is Moses speaking to the children of Israel. He says, "But Yahweh has not given to you a heart to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear, even to this day." Well, this is saying that at that time they didn't have eyes to see or ears to hear. They were hard-hearted, and they had stiff necks. And so the time when that changes is a very important and significant time, a time of great opportunity. And that's the time to which Barki Nafshi refers. And that, as I hope that you guys can all see, is our present state. This is the time where he is opening our eyes to see his ways and opening our ears to hear his teaching. Continuing on now, this is still line 4 of Barki Nafshi. That's 4Q 435, fragment 1, column 1, line 4. "And he is circumcising the foreskin of their hearts, and delivering them on account of his grace, and preparing their feet for the way." Okay, so there's a number of elements here, but notice this is present tense. This is describing an experience which is understood as presently taking place. He is circumcising the foreskin of their hearts. Well, what is the circumcision of the heart? There's a lot to it, and there's many scriptures that talk about this. And we're pretty much just going to look at one here. I'll reference some others, but we will just read the one because it has the fullest explanation. Okay, so some of the references that you guys can write down for circumcision of the heart are Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16. Also Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6. Jeremiah 4, verse 4. Jubilees chapter 1, verse 23. Romans 2, verse 29. And the Epistle of Barnabas, chapter 9, verses 1 to 3. And chapter 10, verse 12. And I'm looking at this, and I think I will actually read two references to the circumcision of the heart, and neither of these are the references that I just read. So the first one is from the Community Rule. It's in 1QS, column 5, line 5. It says this. Actually, I'll start before line 5. This is line 4 or so. They shall practice truth and humility in common, and justice and uprightness and charity and modesty in all their ways. No man shall walk in the stubbornness of his heart, so that he strays after his heart and eyes and evil inclination. But he shall circumcise in the community the foreskin of evil inclination and of stiffness of neck, that they may lay a foundation of truth for Israel, for the community of the everlasting covenant, and so on. Okay, so here we have circumcising the foreskin of evil inclination and of stiffness of neck. So this is definitely something that's present at Qumran. It's the idea of bringing someone to a point of preparedness, no longer having evil inclination and stiffness of neck. Now, this next reference will explain the circumcision of the heart a lot more, and this is from the Odes of Solomon. Now, of course, the Odes of Solomon were written after the Community Rule and the Barki Nafshi, but they are largely influenced by the Qumran writings, such as the Community Rule and the Thanksgiving hymns. And, of course, as we have found in previous studies, the Odes of Solomon were writings produced by the Nazarenes, the original followers of Christ. So this is Ode 11, verses 1 to 3. My heart was pruned, and its flower appeared. Then grace sprang up in it, and it produced fruits for the Lord. For the Most High circumcised me by his Holy Spirit. Then he uncovered my inward being toward him, and filled me with his love. And his circumcising became my salvation, and I ran in the way in his peace, in the way of truth. So you notice here how in Barki Nafshi, the circumcision of the heart is what prepares them for the way. And that's also the case here in Ode 11. Now I want to point out a couple other things about this. In Ode 11, verses 1 and 2 have a number of parallels that explain each other. So it starts out saying, my heart was pruned and its flower appeared. Okay, well, the first thing, my heart was pruned, parallels the first part of verse 2, which says, for the Most High circumcised me. So being circumcised and having the heart pruned is the same in Ode of Solomon 11. So this is a circumcision of the heart because it's a pruning of the heart. So my heart was pruned and its flower appeared. Well, the next thing that we find in verse 2 is, then he uncovered my inward being toward him. So in both instances, something is being revealed, something is being manifested. So its flower appeared, and my inward being was uncovered. That's talking about the same idea. It's a parallelism. This is very common in Semitic poetry. And the word for inward being literally actually is kidneys, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to another place here in Barki Nafshi. But just to remind everyone, kidneys were viewed in these ancient times as the seat of reason. So, again, its flower appeared, and he uncovered my kidneys toward him, my reason toward him. Then grace sprang up in it, and it produced fruits for the Lord. Well, the next thing in verse 2 is, and filled me with his love. Love and grace are the same, or at least grace is one sort of love. And so that's another parallelism. Now, what that shows us is that there's an order to things. The circumcision of the heart precedes the manifestation of reason, and the manifestation of reason precedes the heart being filled with love. And then verse 3 explains this. It says, and his circumcising became my salvation. Notice how it's not equating the circumcision of the heart with salvation itself. It's equating it with something which then becomes the salvation of the individual. So at first, when the heart is circumcised, it is not the salvation of the individual. It is the preparation for salvation. It is the pruning of their heart. It is cutting away that which is there. So this is like in 1QS column 5, line 5, what we just read from the community rule. Circumcising the evil inclination. It's cutting off the evil inclination. It's removing that bad way of thinking. That is what is done first. And then reason appears. Reason is uncovered. And then the person is filled with love, and fruits are produced for the Lord. That's how circumcising becomes salvation. And then, of course, the person is ready to run in the way. So let's read this passage now again from Barki Nafshi. And he is circumcising the foreskin of their hearts and delivering them, or saving them, on account of his grace. His grace is his love. It's unmerited love, like the love of a parent. And preparing their feet for the way. Okay, well, we see here that the circumcising is equated with preparing. This is the preparation for someone to walk in the way. The way, of course, is the way of truth. The way is also referred to in 1QS, column 9, line 17. It's the teachings and practices of the community, and it's even used for the community itself. And you find the same sort of usage within the New Testament, where the community itself is actually called the way. So Acts 9, verse 2, Acts 19, verse 9, and verse 23, and there's several other references within the New Testament that refer to the way. And this here in Ode 11 is just another one of those references. So according to Barki Nafshi, this is what is happening in the present tense. This is what was happening at the time of the writing of Barki Nafshi. Our Heavenly Family was cutting away the evil inclinations from the motives of the poor and the humble, whose eyes had been opened to see his ways and ears to hear his teaching. Well, at least he was in the process of doing that. And the circumcising the foreskin of their hearts is describing the same process. In the Epistle of Barnabas, chapter 9, that's what it describes, circumcising our hearing, cutting away that part of our thinking which makes us unable to hear the truth. So that's the circumcision of the heart. And so right now our Heavenly Family is circumcising the hearts of the branches. They are cutting away that which prevents them from walking in the way. So this is the preparation which we need so much. It's being pruned, so to speak. So, of course, there's much more beyond this. We're just still at the beginning of this, but we are an hour into this. So I'm wondering if you guys want to take a 10-minute break and then to continue on. What do you guys think?
I think that's a great idea, and I just want to really say praise God today for this message. I know I needed to hear this.
Amen. Absolutely. Barki Nafshi is a very encouraging writing. That's why it starts out, Barki Nafshi et Adoni. Bless my whole being. Bless the Lord for all his wonders forever. Amen. So if you are downtrodden, if you are poor and lowly and all of that, hey, this is absolutely for you. So thank you, Heavenly Family. All right, well, let us come together then at 20 after the hour. It's 10 after the hour now. We'll come back at 20 after and continue on.